So now let's talk about the Y chromosome. And to start talking about the Y chromosome, you always have to talk about the X chromosome. And I want that you start observing this schematic and try to compare what is happening. I think the first thing that you see clearly is that the Y chromosome is much smaller than the X chromosome, so it's less than half of the size, the Y chromosome. But if you see in more detail the genes, so for example, if you look for the par section of the chromosome, par 1, here you have also par 1. If you see the par 2, here you will also going to find a par 2. The XCR, here you will going to find an XCR. Some of these genes are here, some of them will be also here. And why this is important? Because I remind you that chromosomes are dynamic entities, and we will talk more about that in the following slides. So they could be examples of pieces of chromosome that break, some of them that duplicate, some of them that change in the direction of the information. And the Y chromosome, when you compare the ancestors of mammals and birds, you can clearly see, and you start comparing all the X and Y chromosome, you see that the X and Y chromosome were more similar than we expect just from this image. But the Y chromosome start losing constantly more and more genes and more content. So remember, when you compare using cytogenetic tools and molecular tools, these two chromosomes, the X and the Y, all the information indicate that they used to be ordinary autosome when you compare the modern ancestors of mammals and birds. Yeah, so they were very similar, and now the Y chromosome only has 3% of the information that compared to the X chromosome, and they slowly start diverging in DNA sequence and DNA content at about the same time in evolution. So when they compare all the ancestors and go and do cytogenetic analysis of different ancestors, the modern ancestors, they start seeing that slowly they they start displaying changes and more changes. And I'm going to show you that with the schematics of your textbook that clearly explain how some pieces of the Y chromosome start getting smaller and start getting smaller. And very important is that in the past, the the recombination between these two chromosomes, between the proto X chromosome and the proto Y chromosome, was similar. And this is something important because right now, although there is a region for recombination, it's much smaller than it used to be. So now I'm going to give you more small facts about the Y chromosome. And one important information about the X and Y chromosome is that although we generally talk about the maleness determined by the Y chromosome, actually there is still some genes in the X chromosome that they are very important for male fertility. In addition to that, if you see there are many regions that repeat, those regions are important sites for recombination. And in the next slide, I will show you exactly where they are located. And one important component, I don't want that you remember every single gene here for the test, but this one, the SRY, is very important because it's the one that is in charge of, is a transcription factor that it will determine the maleness. So it's one of the most important genes to determine maleness, and this transcription factor stimulate the expression of other genes. So important information of this slide. Remember, genes in the X chromosome, they can be important for male fertility. I also talk about there are some repeat sequences that are very important for recombination that I will show you in the next slide. And from all the genes that you have to remember, please remember the SRY, that is a transcription factor that this protein stimulates the transcription of genes that are important to determine maleness. Now I want you to think about the exam. Imagine that I ask you this question in the test. I show you this schematic and I tell you, show me the two more important regions of the Y chromosome. And I don't want that you tell me every single gene. I don't want that you memorize every single gene. I want that you know that this region, if you see, there are components in common. Yeah, and why? Because those regions, as you know, the evolution of those, of the X and the Y chromosome, those regions are still regions for recombination. So they are regions that they are called the pseudo autosomal regions. Yeah, that as they are still in common, they have sites in common, there is region for recombination. And also I want that you remember this SRY region, this transcription factor, this gene that is involved in many functions. And remember, except for that region of recombination, the that I show you there, the Y chromosome doesn't have more regions for recombination. That is very atypical in compared to other chromosomes. So remember, if I ask you for the important regions of the Y chromosome, there is this purple region that we just talked. There's the pseudo-autosomal region, that is a region that is shared by the X and Y, that they still display a homology. We also have the gene SRY, that is a master sex controller gene, that is a transcription factor that encodes the testis determining factor, or TDF, that is very important for male development. And remember, with the exception of the pseudo-autosomal region, the Y chromosome doesn't undergo recombination. Now that we know the basic information to understand the evolution of the X and Y chromosome, now I'm going to give you a more detailed story. And in this schematic of your textbook, that is very simple, they gave us a lot of information. And here you can find the proposed steps that scientists imagine for the creation of the mother Y chromosome. And how it happened? By the chromosomal rearrangement and from an Asian Y chromosome. Okay, so and to do that, I just have to remind you that if you remember the video of that the sex determination is more complicated than we previously expect, that video of the tech education, if you remember the ancestor, for example, in reptiles, um, reptiles like turtles, for example, the sex was determined by temperature. So males and females was determined by temperature. There was no genetic components. In birds, there was not an XY sex determination. Those chromosomes, they are different. And in mammals is by X and Y. And but what we found there is that there is a shortening and loss of genes in the Y chromosome, and it's fascinating. So what they did to study that after that introduction is, and why I told you that introduction, because as I said, uh, sex determination seems to vary a lot during evolution, and here, even in mammals, we see a clear evidence that there's still evolution, and maybe some people say that the Y chromosome, instead of getting longer, it might continue getting shorter. So when you compare the X chromosome of the present and you compare on the other side with the Y chromosome of the present, you find something very interesting. Yeah, you find that they are not only short, but you are also seeing regions that they share in common. And now this is something that I told you before. So you find some regions that they are still there. So there are regions that are still there, some genes, but they seems to move from one chromosome, from one arm of the chromosome to the other one, and they seems that they are inverted. And to test that hypothesis, what scientists have been doing is trying to study mother ancestors, yeah, different mammals, and what they found is that is in all of them there is a clear evidence that there was a reorganization of the chromosomes and there was a loss of parts of the Y chromosome. So let's start talking about that. So when you compare this X chromosome and you compare it to this with the ancient Y chromosome, what you find is that they are very similar. Yeah, so there are some difference in genes, but they look very similar. However, when you start going in evolution and you find a first event, a first rearrangement. There was an inversion, and here you see that this section there was an inversion and there was a break here. So it moves and it went to another part. And then if you move here back, you continue and you move to this one, to the next inversion event. What you see is that now all this region, again, this region broke. There was a break, and there was an inversion that moved to a different region. And some genes were lost, some of them were kept, but they are not in the same place anymore. And then if you move to the next chromosome, what you find when you move from here to the most recent inversion event is that not only that region that we talk here in the past, but also this region was it moved here. It moved and it was inverted. Yeah, so look, all these regions that we were talking, they moved to the other chromosome during evolution, and they are in a different order. Yeah, so now we can have a clear um, evidence that the chromosomes have been rearranged and the information has been the Y chromosome has been shortened. So I talk a lot, but remember, from this schematic that you can look in your textbook, shows a progressive shortening of the Y chromosome. And that is very important. So as I said before, uh, while mammalians, they used to have, they still have a XY zero autosomal region through time. This is due to the inversion of the Y chromosome inferred from the DNA sequence. Yeah, so we infer that this happened based on how the genes move during evolution, and we still have this SRY, a sex determination mechanism, that it was not present in reptiles, it is not present in birds. It only happened in mammals. So it's fascinating. Again, a different way to determine sex happened during evolution. And I'm going to tell you three more ideas. So the first one is, if you see, you compare the modern X chromosome and the ancient of the Y chromosome, as they share many genes in common, so they have a lot of recombination in these regions, but during evolution, there was a restriction in the amount of regions for recombination. And now this is why we have the zero autosomal region for recombination. In addition, the only thing that it remained the same, it was the closer telomeric region, but in those regions, the recombination will be too small. Uh, Another component that I want that you remember, in addition to the progressively restricted recombination, is that imagine if some of those genes are moved to another region, uh, what happened is that, and you're losing so many regions, what happened is that many of the Y chromosome start getting degenerated by mutation. So you lose them, and the only thing that remain there are the genes that are fundamental. The other ones, they are just lost over time, and it seemed that there was a steady selection pressure to lose parts of the chromosomes that they were not essential. And finally, what this shows, if you remember comparing to the ancient Y chromosome, this region was lost. Let me put it with yellow. So this region was lost. Then this region was removed or moved to another place. So what happened is that instead of being a gradual process, there was large chunks of X and Y recombination regions that they were removed from the original region. So that is what right now all the information that we know based on this of how the Y chromosome it has been changing. And now I'm going to show you a small video that summarizes all this information.
What makes boys and girls different? It can be a really complicated question, but when it comes down to biological sex in humans, the difference is in the Y chromosome. We know that the Y chromosome is important, but scientists also know that it's been shrinking in size over millions of years, and some even think it might eventually disappear. But recent studies on the Y chromosome in a lot of mammals suggest that it has more important genes, besides the ones that contribute to maleness. Chromosomes are bundles of DNA and other stuff that are stored in the nucleus of your cells. Most people have 23 pairs of chromosomes, one set from mom and one set from dad. 22 of these pairs look the same in all humans, but the last pair is known as the sex chromosomes, X and Y. Generally, biological females have 2 X chromosomes, and biological males have 1 X and 1 Y. The Y chromosome is less than half the size of the X, and it contains way fewer functional genes. But it wasn't always this way. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the X and Y chromosomes of our human ancestors were the same size, and they could swap genetic information with each other through a process called genetic recombination. Recombination helps us evolve over time and protects against potentially dangerous mutations in our genes. But at some point, the X and Y chromosomes became so different that they lost most of their ability to recombine. So any mutations that changed or deleted part of the Y chromosome couldn't really be fixed, and it kept shrinking over millions of generations. Today, in humans, the Y chromosome that men are carrying around with them has only 3% of the functional genes it once did. But fear not, Y-havers! Many researchers think that this decay seems to have leveled off in most mammals, including humans, over the past 25 million years or so. For example, 2 studies in 2014, one by MIT researchers and one by Swiss scientists, analyzed Y chromosomes across 8 to 15 mammalian species. As expected, they found some of the same sex-determining genes, like the SRY gene, which helps develop all those male reproductive bits, but they also found genes conserved across Y chromosomes in many species that didn't have to do with maleness. These are regulatory genes, genes that regulate the expression of other genes by basically turning them on and off. While most genes on sex chromosomes only need 1 copy to function normally, scientists think some important regulatory genes require pairs. So in females, each X chromosome has 1/2 of a pair of regulatory genes, and in males, there's 1 gene on the X and the paired one is on the Y. So the scientists think that a lot of Y chromosome genes work with the genes on the X chromosome to help regulate other genes that shape healthy human development. But lots more research needs to be done to figure out which pairs of genes affect which parts of development. No matter what though, it seems that the Y chromosome isn't just about creating maleness after all, and it's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. Thanks for asking, and thanks to all of our Patreon patrons, and thanks to all of our